In the dead silence of the Syrian desert, a secret was rising, quiet, hidden, and lethal. While the world stared at Iran, another regime was racing toward the bomb, helped by one of the most dangerous partners on Earth. This is the story of how Mossad uncovered that plot, and how Israel stopped Syria from getting nuclear weapons. In the shadowy arithmetic of Middle Eastern power, some equations are simple. Land equals security. Water equals life. A nuclear weapon equals permanence. It is the ultimate insurance policy. It guarantees a regime's survival. It levels all playing fields, resets all ancient rivalries. It is the one thing you can possess that makes you, in a very real sense, untouchable. For decades, this was the exclusive, terrifying privilege of a select few. In the Middle East, it was an open secret that Israel possessed this insurance policy. Its enemies, one by one, had tried to acquire their own, and one by one, they had been stopped. In 1981, the world watched in shock as Israeli F-16s turned Iraq's Osirak reactor into a pile of smoking rubble. That strike, dubbed Operation Opera, wasn't just a military raid. It was the public declaration of a new doctrine, a red line drawn in the sand that would echo for generations. Coined the Begin Doctrine after Prime Minister Menachem Begin, its message was chillingly clear. Israel will not, under any circumstances, allow a hostile nation in the region to acquire a weapon that could threaten its very existence. It was a promise of preemption. For a quarter of a century, that promise held. Saddam Hussein's ambitions were buried in the Iraqi desert. Muammar Gaddafi in Libya, terrified by the 2003 Iraq War, voluntarily dismantled his own nascent program. But the desire, the need for that ultimate weapon never went away. It simply migrated. By the mid-2000s, all eyes were on Iran. The world was fixated on its centrifuges at Natanz, its heavy water facility at Iraq. Iran's program was loud, defiant, and a matter of intense international diplomacy and debate. But while the world was watching the magician's right hand, the left hand was preparing a trick that was far more subtle, and in some ways, far more dangerous. This new threat wasn't coming from the sprawling, ancient empire of Persia. It was coming from its junior partner, a seemingly broken and predictable state. It was coming from Syria. The Syria of the new millennium was a country in transition. In 2000, the Lion of Damascus, Hafez al-Assad, died after a 30-year iron-fisted rule. His son, Bashar al-Assad, a quiet ophthalmologist educated in London, was pulled from his life in the United Kingdom to take his father's place. The West hoped for a reformer, a modernizer. They got something else. Bashar may have lacked his father's grizzled gravitas, but he inherited his father's ambitions, his father's grievances, and his father's alliances. Syria was a key part of the axis of resistance, a strategic alliance with Iran and its proxy, Hezbollah, in Lebanon. But Syria was the weak link. It had been humiliated in 1982, losing dozens of aircraft to Israel over the Bekaa Valley. It had been forced out of Lebanon in 2005 after the assassination of Rafiq Hariri. In 2006, Syria watched from the sidelines as its proxy, Hezbollah, fought Israel to a bloody stalemate in the Second Lebanon War. That 2006 war was a wake-up call for everyone. For Israel, it was a shock. Their reputation for swift, decisive victory, their deterrence, was visibly cracked. For Syria's ally, Hezbollah, it was a triumph of asymmetric warfare. But for Bashar al-Assad, it taught a different lesson. Hezbollah had survived an Israeli onslaught because it was armed to the teeth with thousands of Iranian-supplied rockets. It was a porcupine, too painful to crush. What then was Syria? It was a conventional army, large but outdated. It couldn't compete with Israel tank for tank or jet for jet. Assad realized he didn't need to win a conventional war. He just needed to guarantee his survival. He needed an insurance policy. He needed to deter Israel, to deter the United States, which had just toppled his neighbor in Iraq on the pretext of WMDs, and to elevate his status from Iran's puppet to its equal partner. He needed the bomb. But how? The lesson of Osirak was seared into the memory of the Arab world. Saddam's mistake was building his reactor in the open, proudly inviting French technicians and, by extension, Israeli spies. Assad would not make that mistake. His program would be the opposite of Iran's. It would not be loud. It would not be a subject of national pride. It would be silent, secret, and buried. It would be built in a place no one would ever think to look. A barren, desolate stretch of desert along the Euphrates River near a town called Deir ez-Zor. And he would not ask the French or the Russians for help. He would go to the one country on earth that specialized in building clandestine, off-the-books nuclear programs for cash. A pariah state that had nothing to lose and everything to gain from sticking a thumb in the eye of the West. He would go to North Korea. This wasn't a new relationship. North Korea and Syria had been partners for decades, with Pyongyang supplying Damascus with Scud missiles and other ballistic missile technology. But this was a new level. The A.Q. Khan network, the Pakistani father of the Islamic bomb, who had created a one-stop shop for proliferation, had proven that the technology was for sale. Now North Korea was picking up the mantle. The plan was simple. North Korea would provide the design, the technicians, and the critical components for a specific type of reactor, a gas-cooled, graphite-moderated reactor. This design was, to a nuclear engineer, a massive red flag. It was an antique. It was incredibly inefficient for producing electricity. In the entire world, almost no one was building this type of reactor for peaceful energy. But it had one singular outstanding quality. It was a factory for plutonium. It was a near-perfect copy of North Korea's own Yongbyon reactor, the beating heart of their nuclear weapons program. The project began in secret around 2001. A location was chosen, Al-Kibar. It was remote, easily secured, and far from any population centers. To the outside world, it was to be disguised. Satellite photos would show a large, windowless, cube-like building, resembling a factory or a warehouse. But it was not, as Syria would later claim, an Arab center for the studies of arid zones. It was a fortress. It was being built with reinforced concrete, designed to withstand an attack, and it was being built with a specific purpose: to house a reactor that would, within a year or two of going critical, produce enough plutonium for 1 or 2 nuclear bombs per year. The construction was compartmentalized. Syrian workers were kept separate from the North Korean technicians. The shipments of sensitive equipment, including the reactor vessel itself, were disguised, often arriving on ships labeled as carrying cement. It was a masterpiece of clandestine construction, and for years, it worked. The world's intelligence agencies, their satellites and analysts, all laser-focused on Tehran and Isfahan, completely missed it, or so it seemed. In Israel, the intelligence community was in a state of self-reflection, bordering on crisis. The 2006 Lebanon War had been, from an intelligence perspective, a failure. They had underestimated Hezbollah's resilience, its tunnel networks, and its anti-tank capabilities. The director of Mossad, Israel's legendary foreign intelligence service, was a man named Meir Dagan. Dagan was a titan, a former general, a man known for his aggressive, outside-the-box thinking. He had been appointed by Ariel Sharon with a simple, chilling directive: to do whatever it took to stop Iran's nuclear program. Dagan took this mission as a sacred trust. He was also haunted by the 2006 war. Amman, Israel's military intelligence directorate, was also smarting. But in early 2007, Amman's analysts had a nagging feeling. They were picking up strange communications, chatter, phone calls between North Korean officials and Syrian numbers. And these calls were all being routed to a single, tiny spot in the desert, a place with no military or civilian significance. They pulled the satellite imagery. They saw a large, square building. It looked, to the untrained eye, like nothing, a large shed. But to a trained photo analyst, there were oddities. A construction project of this size, in the middle of nowhere, with no clear purpose. It had massive water pipes being laid from the Euphrates River, far more water than any arid research center would need. It had heavy lift equipment, and it had no windows. Amman developed a theory. It was a low-confidence theory, but it was terrifying. They believed Syria might be building something nuclear. They presented this theory to Mossad. At first, Dagan was skeptical. His focus was Iran. Syria was a sideshow, but the evidence, thin as it was too disturbing to ignore. This is where the story shifts from satellite analysis to old-fashioned cloak-and-dagger human espionage. Dagan tasked his agents with one mission: find the smoking gun. Find something, anything, that could confirm or deny Amman's theory. The target they settled on was a man named Ibrahim Othman. Othman was the head of Syria's Atomic Energy Commission. He was a scientist, a bureaucrat. He was also, as Mossad discovered, a man who traveled. In early 2007, he was scheduled to attend a conference in Europe. Mossad decided this was their chance. The city was Vienna. Some accounts say London, but the mechanics remain the same. The plan wasn't to assassinate Othman. The Qaidan, Mossad's assassination unit, was stood down. This was a job for Neviot, the break-in unit, and Keshet, the E-operations unit. The goal was not a body. The goal was his laptop. Mossad agents tracked Othman from the moment he landed. They put him under 24/7 surveillance. They had a team in the hotel. They waited. Othman was careful, but he was a man of routine. He left his hotel room to go shopping or to a meeting. The Neviot team, using replicated keys or a simple ruse with the hotel staff, was inside his room in seconds. They didn't steal the laptop. That would be too obvious. They had a computer expert with them. The expert plugged a device into Othman's computer. In a matter of minutes, they copied the entire contents of his hard drive. They also, reportedly, installed a Trojan horse, a piece of software that would give Mossad a permanent backdoor into his computer. Then, they were gone. They were in and out in less than half an hour. Othman returned, never knowing his most valuable secrets had just been stolen. Back at Mossad headquarters in Tel Aviv, the analysts opened the files. What they found made the blood run cold. It was all there. It wasn't a low-confidence theory. It was 100% A to Z fact. The hard drive contained the entire project. There were hundreds of photographs from inside the Al-Kibar facility. They showed the construction in various stages. They showed the reactor vessel. They showed the piping for the gas cooling system. They showed blueprints, contracts, and correspondence between Syrian and North Korean officials. And then They found the Eiffel Tower picture. The one piece of evidence so damning, so perfect, that it erased all doubt. It was a photograph taken inside the reactor hall. It showed a smiling Ibrahim Othman, the man whose laptop they had just plundered. And standing next to him, shaking his hand, was Chon Chibu, a key figure from North Korea's Yongbyon nuclear complex. Mayor Dagan had his smoking gun. He immediately went to the Prime Minister, Ehud Olmert. Ehud Olmert was, at that moment, perhaps the weakest and most unpopular prime minister in Israel's history. The 2006 Lebanon War was seen as a failure. The Winograd Commission, established to investigate the war's failings, was preparing a report that would be scathing. Olmert's political career was hanging by a thread, and now his Mossad chief had just walked into his office and placed a folder on his desk that contained an existential crisis. Dagan laid it out. Syria was building a plutonium reactor. It was a copy of Yongbyon. It was months, maybe a year, from going critical, from being fueled and turned on. This created a terrible deadline. Once a reactor is fueled and operational, it cannot be bombed. An attack on a hot reactor would be an act of radiological warfare. It would release a plume of radioactive fallout that would drift down the Euphrates, potentially poisoning hundreds of thousands of people in Syria and Iraq. It would be an environmental and humanitarian catastrophe. The strike, if it was to happen, had to happen before the reactor was fueled. The clock was ticking. Olmert convened his inner circle, his kitchen cabinet. It was a room full of heavyweights. There was Olmert himself. There was Defense Minister Ehud Barak, a former prime minister and a political rival of Olmert's. There was Foreign Minister Tzipi Livni and the IDF Chief of Staff, Gabi Ashkenazi. And there was Mayor Dagan. The photos were passed around. The silence in the room must have been deafening. The implications were staggering. Olmert laid out the options. Option 1, do nothing. This was not an option. A nuclear Syria, allied with Iran, was an existential threat. Option 2, diplomacy. They could take this evidence to the United Nations, to the International Atomic Energy Agency, IAEA. They could demand inspections. This was the safe, legal route, but everyone in the room knew it was a fool's errand. Syria would deny, delay, and deceive. They would do exactly what Saddam had done. They would play for time. They would scrub the site, bury the evidence, and by the time inspectors were allowed in, if they were allowed in, there would be nothing to find. The reactor would be fueled, and the chance would be lost. Option 3, go to the Americans. Ask the United States to handle it. They had the power, the stealth bombers, the international legitimacy. Option 4, the Begin Doctrine. Israel would act as it had in 1981, alone. Before committing to Option 4, Olmert decided he had to try Option 3. He owed it to his closest ally. In June 2007, Olmert flew to Washington, D.C. for a meeting with President George W. Bush. In his memoir, Decision Points, Bush describes the meeting. Olmert Bush, Vice President Dick Cheney, and National Security Advisor Stephen Hadley. Olmert didn't beat around the bush. He presented the intelligence, the photos, the blueprints, the North Korean connection. He made his case, ending with a simple request. George, I am asking you to bomb the facility. The American team was stunned. The CIA had their own suspicions, but their intelligence was low confidence. This was a smoking gun. Bush, still reeling from the catastrophic intelligence failure of Iraq WMDs in 2003, was instinctively skeptical. He turned to his CIA director, Michael Hayden. "What's our assessment?" Hayden confirmed the building was a reactor and that it was not for peaceful purposes. But he added a crucial, lawyerly caveat. "We have low confidence that it is part of a nuclear weapons program." They had found the reactor, but not the reprocessing facility needed to separate the plutonium or the weapons fabrication plant. To the CIA, this meant the case wasn't a slam dunk. The memory of the 2003 slam dunk speech hung over the room like a shroud. The Bush administration was terrified of being wrong again. Dick Cheney was reportedly in favor of an American strike. He argued that it was a clear-cut case of proliferation and that it would send a powerful message to Iran. But Bush and Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice were more cautious. They were bogged down in two wars, in Iraq and Afghanistan. An unprovoked, preemptive strike on a third Muslim country could set the entire Middle East on fire. It could provoke a massive Syrian retaliation against Israel or against U.S. troops in Iraq. They offered Olmert a different plan, a diplomatic rollout. The U.S. would go public with the intelligence, take it to the UN, and lead a coalition of the willing to impose sanctions and demand inspections. Olmert was horrified. He told Bush, "Your strategy will not work. It will only allow Syria to do what North Korea and Iran have already done, play for time. By the time you're done, it will be too late." The meeting ended. Bush pulled Olmert aside. His final answer, as he wrote in his memoir, was clear. "I told him I had decided on the diplomatic option. I then told him I understood he was in a different position. He was a small country, surrounded by enemies. I could not tell him how to run his country, but I told him that I would not, and could not, give him a green light for a military strike. He had to make that decision, alone." Other accounts are slightly different. Olmert reportedly asked Bush, "Will you stand in our way?" And Bush replied, "I will never tell Israel not to defend itself." Whatever the exact words, the message was the same. The U.S. would not do it, and the U.S. would not officially approve it. But they wouldn't stop it. It was the faintest yellow light a prime minister has ever received. For Olmert, it was enough. He flew back to Israel knowing the burden was entirely on his shoulders. The debate in the kitchen cabinet intensified. Ehud Barak, the defense minister and a former IDF chief of staff, was wary. He was a military man, and he knew the risks. What if a pilot was shot down? What if Syria retaliated with a barrage of Scud missiles? The 2006 war had been costly. He still favored the American diplomatic path. This is where Meir Dagan made his most important argument. It wasn't a military argument. It was a psychological one. He looked at Olmert and Barak and said, "If we do this, and if we do it right, Assad will do nothing." This was counterintuitive. You bomb a country's most secret, most expensive strategic project, and they'll do nothing? Dagan's logic was brilliant. Assad's entire power is built on a myth of strength and resistance, he argued. If we strike this facility, and then we say nothing, what can he do? He cannot admit to the world that he was building an illegal nuclear reactor with North Korea. He will be a pariah, and he cannot admit to his own people or to his allies in Iran that Israel flew into his backyard, destroyed his most precious asset, and his billion-dollar air defense system did nothing to stop them. He will be humiliated. He will be seen as a weakling. No, Dagan insisted. If we give him a way out, he will take it. If we maintain total, absolute silence, it gives him plausible deniability. He can lie. He can claim we bombed an empty shed. He will be angry, but he will be too embarrassed to retaliate. He will swallow his pride, and he will be quiet. It was a staggering psychological gamble. Olmert, the politically weak prime minister, had to decide. Trust his rival, Barak, and the safe, diplomatic path, or trust his spy chief, Dagon, and an incredibly risky all-or-nothing military strike based on a psychological theory? But there was one more piece of the puzzle. The Mossad intel was digital. Olmert wanted physical proof. He wanted to be 1,000% sure. He authorized one of the most daring operations in Israeli history. A small team of elite Sayeret Matkal commandos, Israel's top-tier special forces unit, was tasked with infiltrating Syria and reaching the Al-Kibar site. In mid-August 2007, 2 helicopters, flying low and fast in the dead of night, ferried a dozen commandos deep into enemy territory. They were, according to some reports, dressed in Syrian army uniforms. They landed near the facility. They didn't storm it. Their mission was to get close, take photographs from the ground, and, most importantly, to collect soil samples. They got what they needed and got back to the helicopters. As they were leaving, they were reportedly spotted by Syrian sentries, who opened fire. The commandos fired back, got on the helicopters, and escaped back to Israel. The soil samples were rushed to Israel's nuclear research facility in Dimona. The tests came back in days. The soil was hot. It contained traces of processed, non-natural uranium, and, according to some reports, other elements that were a chemical fingerprint of North Korean nuclear processes. That was it. The debate was over. The digital evidence was confirmed by physical proof. Olmert gave the order. The Israeli Air Force, IAF, would prepare to destroy the target. The mission was codenamed Operation Orchard, or Outside the Box. The planning was meticulous. This was not 1981. Syria's air defense network, while mostly an aging Russian system, was dense, especially near the border. The IAF couldn't just fly in, bomb, and fly out. The mission was given to the 69th Squadron, the Hammers, who flew the F-15I Ra-Am, Thunder, and the 119th and 253rd Squadrons, who flew the F-16I Sufa, Storm. These were Israel's premier long-range strike aircraft, tailor-made for this exact kind of mission. But the most critical part of the plan wasn't the bombers. It was the enablers. It was Israel's electronic warfare, EW capability. The plan was not to jam Syria's radar. Jamming is loud. It tells the enemy you're there. The plan was to hack it. On the night of September 6, 2007, the mission launched. A total of 10 aircraft. 8 were the strikers, 4 F-15Is and 4 F-16Is, loaded with precision-guided bombs and external fuel tanks. The other 2 aircraft were the real stars of the show. An ELINT, electronic intelligence aircraft, likely a specialized Gulfstream G550, and an EW aircraft. The planes didn't fly straight for Syria. That would be suicide. Instead, they flew north, up the Mediterranean coast, as if heading for Turkey. They flew in total radio silence. As the strike package neared the Turkish-Syrian border, they hooked a right, turning east and entering Syrian airspace. This was the moment of truth. This is when the Israeli EW aircraft went to work. It's a capability that is still highly classified, but the effect was like something out of a science fiction movie. The Israelis didn't just blind the Syrian radar, they took it over. They digitally infiltrated the network and fed the Syrian radar operators a false sky picture. On the screens of Syria's Air Defense Command, everything looked perfectly normal. The sky was clear. A few friendly bogies here and there, but no threats. The Israeli jets were, in essence, wearing an electronic invisibility cloak. They were flying deep into Syria, but as far as the Syrian military was concerned, they didn't exist. The planes flew for over 300 miles across Syria. They reached the Euphrates. They saw the target, the large dark cube in the desert, just as it had appeared in Ibrahim Othman's vacation photos. The jets split for the attack run. The F-16Is went in first, reportedly firing Maverick missiles and dropping 500-pound bombs to open up the hardened structure. Then the F-15Is followed, dropping massive, multi-ton guided bombs to penetrate deep into the facility and destroy the reactor vessel itself. One by one, the bombs struck home. Lasers from the jets, or possibly from a Sayeret Matkal team on the ground that had infiltrated again, guided the bombs to their precise impact points. The entire structure was obliterated. It wasn't just damaged, it was annihilated, turned into a crater of smoking, twisted metal. The pilots watched the secondary explosions, confirming the target was destroyed. Then, they turned for home. They flew back out, the same way they came in. The Syrian air defense network remained silent, its operators happily watching their empty radar screens. Back in Tel Aviv, in the pit, the underground IAF command bunker, Olmert, Barak, Dagan, and Ashkenazi had been waiting in agonizing silence. The jets crossed back into friendly airspace. The mission commander broke radio silence for the first and only time. He spoke a single code word: Arizona. The room erupted. Arizona was the code for mission accomplished, all targets destroyed. All aircraft were returning safely. The gamble had paid off. The pilots landed back at their bases. They were met not with fanfare, but with silence. They were debriefed and immediately put under a gag order. They couldn't even tell their families. The next morning, the Israeli military censor issued one of the most severe gag orders in the country's history. The media was forbidden from reporting anything about the operation. They could, as a strange compromise, report on what foreign sources were saying, but no Israeli source could confirm the strike. Now the second half of Meir Dagan's gamble began. Israel had done its part. It had maintained silence. What would Assad do? The first reports were nothing. Silence from Syria. Then, a few days later, the Syrian state news agency, Sana, released a bizarre, short statement. It said that on the night of September 6th, air defense units of the Syrian Arab Army confronted enemy Israeli warplanes that infiltrated Syrian airspace and forced them to leave. It said the planes had dropped bombs on an empty, unused military building, a construction site, and that there were no casualties. It was, as Dagan had predicted, a lie. It was a pathetic, face-saving, transparent lie. And it was the most beautiful sound the Israeli government had ever heard. Assad was taking the out they had given him. He was swallowing his humiliation and pretending it didn't matter. The international community was bewildered. News began to leak. U.S. officials, on background, confirmed a strike had happened and that the target was a North Korean-built nuclear facility. But Israel remained mute. Syria continued to deny. Assad's cover-up was almost as frantic as his secret construction. Within weeks, he had bulldozers at the Al-Kibar site. He had the entire facility scraped clean. All the rubble, all the debris, all the highly radioactive evidence was carted away and buried. Then, in an act of almost comical defiance, he had a brand new, generic-looking building constructed on the exact same spot. He was literally and figuratively paving over his failure. The IAEA, the UN's nuclear watchdog, was suspicious. They demanded to inspect the site. Syria delayed and delayed. Finally, in June 2008, 9 months after the strike, they allowed a team of inspectors to visit. The inspectors arrived at the new building. There was nothing to see, but they had permission to take environmental samples from the surrounding area. They took swabs from the ground, from the changing rooms in the new building, from the banks of the Euphrates. The samples were sent back to the IAEA labs in Vienna. The results were damning. The inspectors found a significant number of anthropogenic, or man-made, uranium particles. This was not natural uranium. This was processed uranium, the kind used in a reactor. They also found traces of graphite. The IAEA confronted Syria with the evidence. Syria's response was desperate. Their ambassador, Ibrahim Othman himself, claimed the uranium particles must have come from the Israeli missiles. It was a scientifically preposterous claim. Guided bombs are not made of processed uranium. The IAEA was not amused. For years, Syria obstructed the investigation, refusing to let inspectors back in. Finally, in 2011, the Director General of the IAEA, Yukiya Amano, issued a formal, scathing report. It concluded, for the first time, that the facility at Al-Kibar was very likely a nuclear reactor, and that Syria had breached its NPT safeguards agreement by not declaring it. By then, no one was listening. By 2011, Syria had other problems. The Arab Spring had arrived, and the country was descending into a brutal civil war. This is where the story finds its final, terrifying vindication. The Deir ez-Zor region, the remote desert province where the Al-Kibar reactor once stood, became a major battleground. In 2014, the area was overrun by a new, horrifying force. The black flag of the Islamic State, or ISIS, was raised over the town. ISIS had captured the exact spot where Syria's nuclear reactor was supposed to be. Think about that. Imagine the counterfactual. Imagine if, in 2007, Ehud Olmert had listened to Ehud Barak and Condoleezza Rice. Imagine if he had chosen the safe, diplomatic path. Imagine the years of UN resolutions, of failed inspections, of Syrian lies. The reactor would have been fueled. It would have gone hot. And in 2014, the butchers of ISIS would not have captured an empty patch of desert. They would have captured an operational plutonium-producing nuclear reactor. They would have had their hands on tons of radioactive material, the makings of a dirty bomb that could have held the entire world hostage. The mind recoils from the implication. The world dodged a bullet it didn't even know was pointed at its head. For over a decade, Israel's role remained an open secret. Everyone knew, but no one could say. The pilots who flew the mission were promoted. Meir Dagan retired as a national hero. Ehud Olmert's political career ended in disgrace over unrelated corruption charges. But this one night, this one decision, would stand as his and Israel's most profound and most secret triumph. Finally, in March 2018, the military censor lifted the gag order. The stories came flooding out. The pilots, now senior colonels, could finally tell their children what they did. The IDF released previously classified footage and photographs. The shadow operation came into the light. Operation Orchard stands as a masterpiece, not just of military precision, but of intelligence and psychology. It was the perfect synthesis of high-tech satellite analysis, old-school human espionage, daring special forces raids, and a profound, cynical, and ultimately correct understanding of a dictator's mind. It was a reminder that while the world debates, and while diplomacy runs its course, sometimes the only thing standing between a rogue state And an unthinkable weapon is the willingness of another state to act, to draw a red line, and to enforce it, alone, in the dark. One stolen hard drive, one midnight raid, and one perfectly executed airstrike erased a nuclear threat before it was ever switched on. Officially, almost no one talked. Unofficially, the balance of power in the Middle East was just rewritten. If you want more deep dives into the covert operations that never make the headlines, don't forget to like, subscribe, and tell me which mission to cover next.